Be honest. Divorce has affected almost every single person watching this video. If your parents didn't get divorced, congratulations. That's about half of you. The rest have absolutely been affected. If you haven't been divorced, that's awesome. Stay married. If you have been divorced, God's grace is sufficient in every situation and circumstance. However, given that culture shrugs off divorce like it's nothing, we need to take a very close look at how God views divorce. We'll be looking at two specific passages today that discuss the issue of divorce. Jesus addresses divorce all throughout the Gospels, but today we'll be in Mark chapter 10. Then we'll discuss what Paul says about marriage and divorce in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Let's do it. First, we have to discuss what Jesus says. I always laugh whenever people tell me that Jesus never talked about the true definition of marriage in the Bible. In other words, people will say that Jesus never addressed homosexuality or homosexual marriage in the Bible. Neither of these claims are true if you actually read the New Testament for more than 2 seconds. Mark chapter 10 is just a small example of Jesus addressing the most important human relationship. The Pharisees asked Jesus, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" This certainly is an issue that the Pharisees would have discussed endlessly, and they wanted to catch Jesus. In addition, notice how their question in and of itself has little care for the sanctity and the value of marriage. They're simply asking Jesus if they can get away with what they've been getting away with, divorcing for little to no reason. Jesus turns it back on them and lets them know in so many words that the reason Moses had allowed for divorce was because of their hardened hearts. This is an amazing revelation because it pierces to the heart of what the Pharisees were really about, and it pierces to the heart of the divorce issue today. Divorce in the 21st century, just as it was in the first century, is a matter of the heart, nothing else. When people decide to get divorced, they always allow their hearts to harden. Jesus came with a new way and a new command for marriage, and it wasn't even all that new. He was bringing it back to what God had instituted from the very beginning. He quotes Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 and Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 as a reminder of how God intended marriage to function. One man, one woman, leaving their homes to unite with each other, becoming one flesh. Let's just take a quick look in Mark chapter 10 to see what Jesus specifically says. He quotes again in Genesis in verse 6 of Mark chapter 10. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. God intended marriage to function. One man, one woman, leaving their homes to unite with each other, becoming one flesh. Then he takes it the step further by saying, what God has joined together, let nobody separate. That's Mark chapter 10, verse 9. These ideas surrounding marriage are pretty crystal clear coming from Jesus. It's one man, one woman, and divorce isn't an option. He then goes on to say in verses 11 through 12 of Mark chapter 10 that if a man divorces his wife and marries another woman, he's committing adultery, and vice versa for women, obviously. This thought attacked the idea of the day that you could divorce your spouse for any number of reasons because it was legal, no matter how true they actually were. Divorce had become flippant and a way for people to live selfish lives. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 31 through 32, Jesus makes divorce also applicable to situations of adultery. So here's the story so far. God has joined together man and woman for the unique and powerful connection called marriage. What he's put together, no one can separate, except for when there's adultery. This extreme breach in trust is something God allows as grounds for divorce because of the level of pain and betrayal that it causes. So is that it? Well, let's take a look at Paul's continued teaching on divorce in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10, Paul gives the command from God. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. Still not much wiggle room in the realm of divorce for Christians. It's pretty straightforward. Don't divorce. If you do, give it some time and come back together. And of course, Paul is talking to Christians here. We know that the world is going to do what they want to do. If you got divorced before you became a Christian, then we're playing by a whole different set of rules. Paul is trying to exhort the Christian community on marriage because strong marriages are a great evangelistic tool for God's kingdom. Then he goes on to say in verses 12 through 16, we're going to pick up right there. To the rest I say this, not I, the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in these circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will ultimately save your wife? A pretty all-encompassing and powerful teaching here from Paul, and we need to unpack it to see what it means. Basically, if you're a Christian and your spouse is not, you need to stay with them if they're willing to stay with you. You can sanctify them, and your children will be sanctified through your belief. Then, Paul says, if the unbeliever leaves, let them. God has called us to live in peace. Their salvation is their own choice. This is what God's about. He's a free will granting God. These two final verses have been a source of debate and contention in the church, especially in recent years. It's obviously God's design for marriage to last for life, and for divorce to be the last-ditch option in the case of adultery. However, there also seems to be an allowance in this passage if the unbelieving spouse wants to divorce. There are many ways to interpret this specific passage. Some have taken the liberty to make it mean that if a spouse is behaving and acting as an unbeliever, there are grounds for divorce. Others have said that divorce is only an option after the believing spouse has done everything in their power to save the marriage, and the unbelieving spouse simply won't reciprocate. Then there's the issue of what is allowed after the divorce is final. Can the believing spouse get remarried or not? Are they only allowed to remarry their previous spouse when and if they come around? What I tend to lean into concerning all of this debate is the spirit of law over the letter. In my view, there is certainly grounds for divorce for a Christian couple if one of the spouses is acting in a way that's clearly against the character of Christ, as Paul lays out in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Whether it's repeated addiction, substance abuse, spousal or child abuse of the physical, sexual, or verbal kind, all of these factors must be taken into consideration when determining when the spouse has abandoned their walk with Christ and has chosen to, quote-unquote, leave. Obviously, if there's a dangerous situation, that spouse needs to get away as soon as possible. This is a given. Both things can absolutely be true. God can hate divorce, and there can be legitimate reasons for divorce, exemplified in the scriptures. And at the end of the day, God forgives, He restores, and makes new. If you've been affected by divorce in a real way, God sees you and loves you. He's also given us His word to guide us. If there's any way to be reconciled to your spouse, I really believe God wants us to seek that reconciliation. If your marriage is tough, but your spouse is willing to stick it out, ask God for guidance. And if your spouse has abandoned the faith and has decided to abandon your marriage, there is a clear mandate in the scriptures to just simply let them go. God hates divorce, but loves you. I hope this helped. Have a great day.